You said this colony had no males.
It didn't until you arrived.
So the beacon was a trap?
The house is now registered to you.
Why are both your names on it? Because a home requires a family. Before sunrise, you must choose a wife.
And if I choose neither?
Then they discover what you really are. We have to go, now! Run!
Chapter 1. The documentation arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays at Aerith 6 were for paperwork. I was at my desk in the Settlement Coordination Office, working through the quarterly grain transport rerouting, a problem that had been generating 17-page memos for 3 weeks without producing an actual solution. When Administrator Peth Valorin came through the door, set a thick-bound folder on the corner of my desk, smoothed the cover twice with both hands, and then stepped back to the far side of the room as though he expected the folder to do something he did not want to be standing near when it happened. I looked at the folder, then at him. Is this the River Survey reclassification? No, Peth said. He had the expression of a man who had been carrying a piece of news for 3 days and was deeply relieved to finally be setting it down somewhere that was not himself. It is the Article 11 housing allocation. I had been at Aerith 6 for 14 months. In that time, I had processed 47 settlement intake applications, rerouted the colony's grain transport grid twice, completed a preliminary mineral survey of the Eastern River Valley, sat through 31 administrative meetings that could have been shorter, and eaten approximately 412 meals in the common dining hall, most of them adequate. I knew the colony's documentation the way I know survey equipment, by function, not by sentiment. Article 11 of the Compact Frontier Resettlement Charter was the male deficit provision. I had read it once during my first week. The way you read everything during your first week when you are new to a posting and trying to understand what the rules are. And then I had filed it under provisions unlikely to affect me. I looked at the folder again. The colony's gender registry triggered the threshold last month, Peth said, from the far side of the room. He spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed the accurate version of something he finds uncomfortable. 31% male-identified residents. The threshold is 35. When a frontier settlement falls below the threshold, Article 11 allows the registry to assign co-residency arrangements to qualifying males in good standing. He paused. You are the only qualifying male in good standing currently residing at Aerith 6. I qualify, I said. Because you are the only male with a registered housing unit of sufficient square footage and no disqualifying administrative flags. Also that, Peth agreed. He had not moved from the far wall. I opened the folder. The documentation was thorough, as documentation under the Compact Frontier Resettlement Charter tends to be when the Compact wants to be certain. You understand there is no ambiguity about what is being asked of you. Article 11, Section 3, Subsection B. In the event a frontier settlement falls below the 35% male resident threshold, the Colonial Registry may designate co-residency arrangements with registered males in good standing, provided the male resident holds a housing unit of qualifying size. The arrangement is not optional for the designated male unless he can demonstrate qualifying hardship. I could not demonstrate qualifying hardship. My 2-room unit on the settlement's north block was objectively large enough to house 3 adults, and the settlement's logistical needs were genuine. This was not a matter of interpretation. I had seen the colony's residential allocation charts. The math was not close. The arrangement carried a formal housing upgrade. My current 2-room survey coordinator's quarters on the north block would be exchanged for the 3-room unit on the eastern terrace, which had been sitting empty for 6 months since the mineral survey team that built it had transferred out. The compact would be registered in the resettlement database as a formal cohabitation compact under Article 11's provisions, with all 3 co-residents listed as registered frontier settlers in good standing. The 2 co-residents assigned to me were listed by name, species affiliation, and prior registry status. The first was Celadin, formerly of the Valorith Dawn Compact Court Administrative Division, now registered as a resettlement applicant under the voluntary exile provision. Her prior registry standing had been suspended 18 months ago, following a court reorganization in which her entire administrative tier was dissolved. Not for cause. The tier had simply ceased to exist, along with every professional standing tied to it. Article 11 co-residency would restore her standing as a registered compact resident and reinstate her professional classification, which would allow her to practice administrative and legal services work in a frontier colony context. Species, Valorath. Age equivalent, 44 standard years. Professional classification, administrative and legal services, senior grade. The second was Ravaketh, formerly a territorial assessment specialist attached to the Velsarith Frontier Survey Corps, now registered as a resettlement applicant following the dissolution of her Corps contract. Her registry standing had lapsed 8 months prior. Article 11 co-residency would restore it. Species, Velsarith. Age equivalent, 38 standard years. Professional classification, survey and territorial assessment, senior grade. I read the documentation twice through, including the subsections most people skip. Then I looked at Peth, who had not moved from the far side of the room. When do they arrive? Tomorrow morning, Peth said. Early. Intake processing is already complete, he added, with the careful precision of someone choosing words that were both technically accurate and socially minimal. They were processed separately. I closed the folder and tucked it under my arm. I will need the house key for the Eastern Terrace unit. He handed it to me at arm's length, across the full width of the room, and I went. The Eastern Terrace unit was a 4-minute walk from the coordination office, North Block Corridor, across the settlement's central square, up the short stairway connecting the main residential block to the Eastern Terrace row. I had passed the building dozens of times on my regular routes. I had never had a reason to go inside. It was a better house than I had been expecting. 3 rooms with real wall insulation. Door seals that actually held against the plateau's temperature differential, which dropped 12 degrees between afternoon and early morning, and which my current unit's seals had been failing to fully compensate for since my 4th month here. Flooring that did not flex when you walked across it. A covered terrace facing east with a view of the valley below. And on a clear morning before the daily haze settled in, you could see the full length of the river valley and the bend at the 4-kilometer mark where the gradient shifted. The mineral survey team had built it for long occupation. You could tell from the choices they made. Solid walls, well-placed windows, a kitchen alcove positioned to catch the morning light before the haze cut it off, a storage area beneath the rear stairway that was, by my immediate estimate, very nearly the exact right volume for survey equipment of my particular quantity and type. I say very nearly because I would need to see it with the equipment inside to be certain. But the dimensions were promising. The upper floor had 2 real rooms. The eastern one was larger, with a window that ran nearly the full width of the wall and a built-in desk surface along the interior wall. The western one was somewhat smaller, but faced the survey route and the descent trail, so you could see the trailhead from the window without moving from the desk. A third room, smaller still, sat off the terrace on the ground level, opening directly onto the outdoor space. I walked through the whole unit once at standard survey pace, which is to say I noted spatial dimensions, light quality, and functional features without deciding anything about them yet. Then I sat on the terrace with the valley spread below me, the plateau's edge, the descent trail winding down into the mineral river valley, the river itself a dark line at the valley floor, already in shadow in the late afternoon light. I sat there for a while. What I was doing, if I am being accurate about it, was thinking. I did not frame it as thinking at the time, because most of what passed through my mind during those 20 minutes was not particularly analytical. It was more the ordinary mental process of a person understanding that a situation has changed. I was going to be sharing a house with 2 people I had never met, under a colonial charter provision I had not requested, in an arrangement that the charter's administrative language called a cohabitation compact, and that most people in frontier settlements called, without much ceremony, an Article 11 marriage. I noted this fact the way I note most things, with accuracy and without excessive attachment to whatever I might feel about it. The 2 women had professional classifications that were genuine and senior grade. One had been running an administrative division at a compact court. The other had been doing territorial survey work in the field for what the documentation suggested was a substantial portion of her career. They had both ended up at Aerith 6 through circumstances that had nothing to do with any failing on their part. Their registry standings had lapsed because the institutions they were attached to had dissolved around them. Article 11 co-residency would restore those standings. That was the actual function of the arrangement. I considered this for another few minutes, and then went back to my current quarters to pack. A survey coordinator's possessions are calibrated for relocation. Equipment, reference materials, the personal items that fit in a standard carry case, which in my case were not numerous. By the time I had made 2 trips between the North Block unit and the Eastern Terrace, transferred my equipment to the storage under the stairs, confirmed that the dimensions were indeed adequate, and arranged the working materials I keep near my desk in the arrangement I prefer, the night lights were beginning to come on across the valley. The river at the bottom was a dark line catching the edge of the settlement's exterior lighting. I put the kettle on. The colony supply contract did not run to anything better than dark grade tea, and had not in the 14 months I had been here. I was not under the impression that this was going to change. I made a cup, took it out to the terrace, and looked at the valley while I drank it. Then I went back inside and thought about room allocation. The eastern room had the better morning light. The window ran from 6 in the morning until close to 9 before the plateau's daily haze moved in and shut it off. Morning light matters for document work, for reading contracts and drafting protocols, and doing the kind of detailed administrative review that benefits from good visibility and a stable working surface. Celadon's professional classification was administrative and legal services, senior grade. The eastern room was hers. The western room had the terrain view, the trailhead, the survey route, the descent to the valley floor. If you were a territorial assessment specialist and you woke up every morning to a window facing the terrain you were meant to be assessing, that was useful, not sentiment, just function. The western room was Ravakith's. The small room off the terrace opened onto the outdoor space. My survey equipment lived under the stairs. I was up before most of the settlement on most mornings, out on the eastern trail by 6 or 6:15. I did not need a large sleeping room, and I had never particularly wanted one. I found a sheet of paper in the supply drawer in the kitchen and wrote the allocation out by hand. 3 headings, 3 rooms, a brief note under each explaining the reasoning. At the bottom I added, preliminary suggestion only. If you have constraints or preferences I am not aware of, this can be adjusted. I put it on the kitchen table where they would see it when they came in. Then I washed my cup, set 2 clean ones on the counter beside the kettle, put the tea packet where it would be visible, and went to bed. I had read the Article 11 documentation twice. There was nothing in it that would change on a 3rd reading. The situation was what it was, clear, specific, and not particularly suited to the kind of sustained worrying some people do about situations they cannot alter. Tomorrow morning, 2 people would come through the door of this house. I had put their room allocation on the table and set cups out for tea. That was the preparation I was capable of making. It seemed, on balance, like enough. Outside, the valley held whatever the valley holds at night on a frontier plateau. The sound of wind moving across the mineral substrate, the faint distant texture of water over stone at the valley floor, and the colony's edge lighting making its slow unchanging pattern along the eastern ridge. I had been listening to those sounds from various buildings in this settlement for 14 months, and I had learned to find them useful. The way you learn to find most things useful if you are paying attention and have enough time. I went to sleep at 2200. Tomorrow morning was going to come at the same time it always did. Chapter 2. Parallel occupation. They arrived at 6 in the morning, separately, within 11 minutes of each other. I learned later that this was approximately the minimum separation they could have arranged, given that intake processing had placed them in adjacent temporary units the night before. Whether the 11 minutes was deliberate or coincidental I did not ask. I had been up since 5:15. The kettle was on. The room allocation sheet was on the kitchen table where I had left it. I had reviewed the Article 11 documentation one final time over my morning tea, not because I expected to find anything new in it, but because I am the kind of person who reviews things before they happen and finds it useful. Celadon came through the door first. She was tall, close to a head taller than me, with the particular upright posture of someone who had spent years in institutional settings where posture communicated standing. Her skin was deep teal green, the kind of color that shifts depending on the light, darker in shadow and clearer when the sun comes through a window directly. Her hair was black with silver threading at the temples, worn in a tight formal registration braid that looked as though it had been arranged that morning with considerable precision. Her eyes were pale amber, the specific amber of old glass, and they moved across the room in a particular way. Not the look of someone arriving somewhere, but the look of someone taking inventory. She had 2 carry cases. She set them down in the entry without being asked, which told me she knew not to block a doorway, which told me something about the kinds of environments she had worked in before this one. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at me. She looked at the handwritten sheet on the table. "You have allocated the rooms," she said. Her standard was precise, faintly accented, each word placed with deliberate care. The way someone speaks a second language correctly, rather than fluently. "Preliminary suggestion," I said. "You may have preferences or constraints I am not aware of." She picked up the sheet and read it. She had the reading posture of someone who processed documents for a living. A slight forward lean, eyes moving in a specific pattern. A brief stillness at the end of each section while she categorized what she had read before continuing. She set it back down. "The Eastern room has the better window orientation for morning work," she said. "I know. That is why I put it as your first option. Administrative and legal services work tends to benefit from morning light, and the Eastern room gets it from 6 until approximately 9, before the plateau haze comes in." There was a pause. She looked at me the way people look at something when they are updating their working model of it in real time. "The tea is on the counter," I said. "Dark grade. Unfortunately, the colony supply contract does not include anything better, but I can put in a request to the next transport if you have a specific preference." She poured herself a cup. She did not comment on the quality, which I noted. It meant either that she was too polite to say it was poor, or that she had spent enough time in frontier postings that dark grade no longer surprised her. Given what her file said about 18 months of suspended registry standing, I thought the second explanation was more probable. Rebekah arrived 9 minutes later. She was shorter than Celadon by approximately 20 centimeters and moved the way people move when they have spent years working in field conditions. Economical, unhurried, with a constant low-level awareness of the room's geometry that was not anxiety but habit. Her skin was warm bronze green, the color of river stone in late afternoon light. Her hair was copper red, worn at a practical length, the kind of cut that required no maintenance, and had clearly been chosen for exactly that reason. Her dark gold eyes covered the room in about 3 seconds. Registered Celadon at the counter, registered me at the table, registered the sheet of paper, and came to rest without any particular expression. She set her pack down just inside the door. "Rebekah," she said to me. It was not quite a greeting, and not quite a formal introduction. It was identification, the way field personnel identify themselves in operational contexts. Name only. Because in the field the name is the operationally relevant information, and everything else can wait. "Kale Moran," I said. "The sheet on the table has the preliminary room allocation. There is tea on the counter." She looked at the sheet. Then she looked at Celadon. Celadon looked back at her. The silence that passed between them in that moment had a texture to it. Not hostile, precisely, but compressed. The specific compression of 2 people who had each been told they were going to share a space with a third person none of them had chosen, who had each independently decided they were going to be the reasonable one about it, and who were now making first contact across the width of a kitchen alcove with that third person present, and an Article 11 compact already filed in the registry. "The Western room faces the survey route and the valley descent trail," I said. "Better terrain visibility from the window, if that matters to your work. Territorial assessment usually means field orientation is relevant." Rebekah looked at me for a moment with the same flat assessment she had given the room, applied now to a specific variable. "Western room," she said. "That works. Good. I will take the small room off the terrace. My equipment fits in the storage under the stairs, and I do not need a large sleeping room. I am usually out on the survey route before 6 anyway." Neither of them said anything to this. I poured myself a second cup of tea, picked up my survey tablet, and went to the terrace, where 3 weeks of river gradient data was waiting for my attention and was not going to organize itself while I stood in the kitchen. The first 2 weeks were an exercise in parallel occupation. We shared the house the way 3 people share a transit vessel when none of them requested the assignment, with functional efficiency and careful allocation of common spaces. No one formalized any of it. No one needed to. All 3 of us had operated in close quarters before, And the basic logic of shared space is not complicated. You stagger the kitchen. You manage the common areas with enough awareness that you are not in each other's way. You accept that some inconvenience is part of the arrangement and that manufacturing friction costs more than absorbing it. The kitchen operated in windows that nobody discussed. Celadin was up before dawn most mornings. She worked in the eastern room with the door half open, and the sounds that came through were consistent and rhythmic. Stylus on tablet. Occasional brief movement to retrieve a reference from the document case she kept beside the desk. And, very faintly, the sound of her reviewing something aloud in Velorath, which she stopped doing after the third day when she presumably concluded I could not hear it. She was correct. I could not hear it from the terrace room. I heard it on the third morning, only because I happened to be in the kitchen at the same time she was speaking, and the sound carried through the half-open door for approximately 30 seconds before I moved away. She drank tea in precisely measured quantities, which I noticed because the pot was always full when I came to the kitchen in the early morning. Always, not sometimes full, not usually full, always. She was tracking it and refilling it before it ran low. I noticed this on the third day. On the fourth day, I went to the colony supply point for my usual consumables and bought a second packet of tea. I put it on the counter without saying anything about it when I came back. She noticed it the following morning. I saw the brief pause when she came to the kitchen and found the second packet there. She said nothing. That was the correct response to a logistical courtesy. You acknowledge it by using it, not by discussing it. Revikith was out at first light and back before midday, usually with soil or sediment samples from whatever section of the plateau or valley she was assessing that week. She had set up a field analysis station in the storage space at the back of the house within 48 hours of arriving, which told me she had done this before and knew exactly what she needed and where she needed it. Her terrain data spread across the kitchen table in tight organized rows during the late morning hours and was always completely cleared before the next person needed the space. She ate at the settlement dining hall for the first 2 weeks. I did not comment on this. It was a reasonable choice and not my business. On the fifth day, she corrected an error in my river gradient data. I had left my survey tablet on the kitchen table that morning, not intentionally. Just the carelessness of moving too quickly between the terrace and the kitchen and setting things down in the wrong place. When I came back for it, I found a correction note in the margin of the third-month seasonal projection. My notation, not hers, which meant she had written it in my shorthand after reading the data closely enough to learn the format. Correction was that I had used a standard gradient assumption that the specific mineral composition of Aerith 6's eastern river did not support. A standard assumption that most survey models use without questioning because it is accurate often enough. In this case, it was not accurate, and she had seen why. The catch required knowing both the standard assumption and the specific geology of this particular river system, which meant she had done this type of survey work before in systems with similar substrate and knew exactly where the standard assumption broke down. I incorporated the correction and noted the source in my log. Third-month seasonal correction. Revikith K. Field notation. Day 5. Then I submitted the updated log to the colony's survey archive, with the correction attributed to her by name and professional classification. I did not mention any of this to her directly. There was nothing to mention. It was her correction. The record should say so. They did not talk to each other. Not in those first 2 weeks. Not directly. They communicated the way field personnel communicate in shared operational environments when direct communication has not yet been established, through the placement of objects, the timing of movements, and the careful management of shared resources. It was not unfriendly. It was not yet anything else. Two professionals who had each been through enough disrupted postings and dissolved institutional arrangements to understand that shared space works better than when they contest it. So they managed it from a distance. I did not push it. I am not, by nature or by 14 months of frontier posting experience, a person who pushes things before they are ready to move. My work is coordination logistics. Take the facts of the situation as they are. Identify what is needed. Apply it. Do not require the situation to be something other than it is in order to work with it. On the 10th day, Celadin came to the terrace while I was reviewing the river survey model. She stood at the terrace doorway for a moment, which was unusual. She normally moved directly to wherever she was going in the house. She was not a person who paused without reason. The colony's document processing system has a redundant classification error in the agricultural sector filings, she said. I identified it this morning while reviewing the settlement charter documentation for my registry restoration application. I set down my tablet. What kind of error? The base document for the quarterly agricultural allocation uses an outdated compact classification index. The error is systematic. It propagates through every filing that references the base document, which is approximately 60% of the agricultural sector's output. She paused. She had a particular way of pausing before an estimate that distinguished it from a certainty, and I had started to recognize it. It will affect the quarterly supply allocation if it is not corrected before the third month filing closes. That is 19 days from today. Can you write a correction protocol? I can write it. I do not have administrative submission authorization under my current registry standing. Article 11 Co-residency restores standing, but the processing lag is approximately 30 days from our compact registration date, which was 4 days ago. I have coordinator submission access, I said. If you write the protocol, I can submit it under my authorization, with you listed as originating reviewer. She considered this for 2 seconds. It is not a long time, but it was longer than she usually took before speaking, which meant she was verifying something rather than simply processing. That is the correct procedural approach, she said. The originating reviewer notation will stand in the record as the identifying attribution when my standing is formally restored. Bring it to me when it is ready. I will review it for any coordination office elements you may not have access to and then submit. She nodded and went back inside. On the 14th day, Rebekah brought her terrain data to the kitchen table, as she did most late mornings, and spread it out in her usual organized pattern. Then she stopped. She was looking at my river gradient chart, which I had pinned to the wall beside the alcove window as a working reference 3 days earlier. She looked at it for a while. Not the casual look of someone glancing at what is on a wall. The specific focused attention of a territorial assessor reading a dataset she did not design. Your eastern sample points are off by a gradient tier, she said. The third-month seasonal shift moves the river threshold. I have seen the same pattern in the Velserath survey system. Similar mineral composition in the substrate. Different planetary system. But the gradient dynamics follow the same mechanics. I know they are off, I said. I have been waiting for the third-month data window to recalibrate. The comparison set I need is not in the colony's records. The Eastern Valley has not been surveyed at sufficient depth. She looked at the chart for another moment. I have the Velserath comparison data, she said. Different system, as I said. But the gradient mechanics are standard across mineral substrate river systems in this composition band. If you want it, I can convert it to your notation format. I will take it, I said. She sat down across from my survey tablet. We spent 40 minutes cross-referencing gradient tiers. She knew the Velserath dataset with the particular depth that comes from having collected most of it yourself in the field, which is different from knowing data you have inherited or been handed. By the end of it, the river gradient model was more accurate than it had been for 3 weeks, and I had a Velserath benchmark dataset that was going to change how I approached the rainy season projections significantly. She left the comparison data on the tablet when she was done. She marked it in her own shorthand. 3 words. Velserath Eastern Benchmark. Third-month calibration reference. Below that, her initials. I added it to the survey archive with full attribution and went back to work. Neither of us discussed it further. There was nothing to discuss. She had data that was relevant to my model. I needed it. She offered it. I used it. The record reflects where it came from. That is the entirety of what happened. The settlement dining hall had a long central table and 4 smaller ones arranged around the edges. For the first 2 weeks, Celadon sat at the small table near the north window. Rebekah sat at the small table near the supply counter, the maximum possible distance between the two of them within the room's dimensions. I sat at the long table because the long table was the most efficient option for someone eating with a survey tablet and a notebook. On the 16th day, Celadon came into the dining hall to find both small tables occupied by the colony's afternoon maintenance crew, who had come in early and taken every available seat. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room. Then she took the seat across from me at the long table. set her document case beside her chair, poured herself tea from the hall's supply, and began reading the agricultural correction protocol she was drafting. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. We worked at the same table. On the 18th day, Rebekah came in and found both small tables still claimed by the maintenance crew, who had apparently decided the smaller tables were preferable and were now occupying them consistently at every meal. The long table had me and Seladin at one end and 4 colonists at the other. Rebekah looked at the room, looked at the available seat beside me, and sat down because it was open and she was carrying a soil sample case that needed room on the table beside her tray. The 3 of us ate at the same table in the arrangement of 3 people who happened to be at the same table, which is not quite the same as eating together. No one said anything about it. I did not consider it worth noting in any formal sense, but I noted it. On the 21st day, I came back from the Eastern River Trail to find Seladin at the kitchen table with the compact charter documents spread across the left half of the surface, and Rebekah at the right half with her terrain mapping grid arranged in her usual organized rows. They were not speaking, but they had divided the table between them, which meant at some point during the morning they had communicated about the table, which was the first direct negotiation I was aware of between them. I made tea for all 3 of us, set the cups on the center line of the table where they could each reach one, and sat down at the end of the table where there was still room for my survey data. Nobody said anything. It was a productive afternoon. Chapter 3, The Survey Run. The survey run that changed the shape of things happened in the 6th week, and like most things that change the shape of a situation, it arrived without announcing itself as anything significant. The Eastern River Valley had a bend at the 4-kilometer mark where the gradient shifted. I had been tracking it since my 2nd month at Aerith 6, trying to build an accurate seasonal model for the river system, and the data I was working with had a gap in it that I had not been able to close. Rebekah's Velserath comparison data had helped me identify where the gap was and roughly how large it was, but identifying a gap and closing it are different problems. The model required a direct measurement at the bend point during a specific low water window that only occurred in the early morning hours, when the thermal differential between the valley floor and the plateau edge dropped the water level by approximately 20 centimeters and made the gradient visible at the sediment line. Outside that window, the water ran too high to read it cleanly. The measurement required 2 people, one at the upper marker to hold the baseline gauge and maintain the reference reading, one at the bend itself to take the gradient measurement and the sediment sample. Normally, I ran this kind of survey with one of the colony's junior infrastructure staff who had been helping with the Eastern Valley work on a part-time basis. He was out on a colony transport run all week and would not be back before the low water window closed. I mentioned this at dinner, not as a request, just as a logistical fact I was working through. The early window was the day after tomorrow. I needed a 2nd person at the upper marker, and I was going to have to either find someone or defer the measurement until the next cycle, which was 3 weeks out and past the point where it would still be useful for the rainy season projection. Rebekah set her fork down. What is the measurement window? 6:40 to 7:15, I said. Low water slack before the thermal shift moves the sediment back. 35 minutes total, and about 20 of it is the actual measurement. The rest is travel time between positions. I know that window, she said. She turned slightly to look at the terrain map folded on the chair beside her, the one she had brought from the terrace earlier. I have measured 3 river systems with the same thermal pattern, 2 on Velserath and 1 on a border moon in the Keth sector. She looked back at her plate. I can hold the upper gauge. I noted how she said it, not offering, stating a fact about what she was capable of. The gauge setup takes about 3 minutes if you know the system, I said. I can show you. Standard compact survey gauge, she said. I know the system. I looked at her. She was not performing competence. She was describing it. There is a difference. And after 6 weeks in close proximity to someone, you learn to tell the 2 apart. Good, I said. We leave at 6:10. Seladin had been at the other end of the table, reviewing the expanded version of the correction protocol, which she had extended 2 days earlier to include a water classification issue she had found while working through the agricultural-based document. She looked up. The eastern trailhead, she said. It is accessible from the terrace. It was a statement of topographic fact. The covered terrace of our house opened directly onto the trailhead that descended to the valley floor. I had walked it so many times in the past 14 months that I had stopped thinking about it as a feature of the building. "It is," I said. "I have no appointments before 8. There was a pause at the table. Rivakith had not looked up from her plate. I ran a rapid assessment. Celadon was an administrative professional, not a field specialist. The trail to the valley floor was 45 minutes of frontier terrain. Not dangerous, but demanding of consistent attention, particularly on the 2 loose stone sections near the middle of the descent, where the plateau substrate fractured and the footing required care. Her physical bearing over 6 weeks suggested she was capable of it. Her working patterns suggested she was the kind of person who, once she decided something was the correct thing to do, did it thoroughly and without complaint. "The trail is 45 minutes down and 45 minutes back," I said. "The measurement itself is 20 minutes. The 2 loose stone sections in the middle need attention, but the rest of the descent is a standard frontier route. You do not need survey equipment. Reasonable footwear is sufficient." "I have reasonable footwear," Celadon said. "Then come," I said. "An extra pair of hands for the sediment sample containers is useful, and I did not want to ask." She set her document in the case and closed the clasp. "What time?" 6:10. She nodded and picked up her tea. Across the table, Rivakith looked at Celadon. It was the first time, to my knowledge, that either of them had looked at the other with something other than careful peripheral management. Celadon, for her part, looked back. It was not warm and it was not unfriendly. It was 2 professionals who had just made an implicit agreement to spend a morning in the field together, each taking a quiet measure of what that meant. 6:10, I said again, and went back to my gradient data. We left at 6:10. The trail from the plateau down to the valley floor was the kind of terrain I had come to know well in 14 months at Aerith 6. Not hostile, just precise. It required you to pay attention in a specific way, the way frontier terrain always does. And if you stopped paying attention, it would let you know immediately. The morning at that hour had a particular quality of light, a gray-blue that exists only before the sun clears the eastern ridge and the day becomes itself. The color of potential. The valley below was audible before it was visible. The specific sound of moving water over a mineral substrate, which is different from any other kind of moving water once you have learned to listen for the distinction. I went ahead on the trail because I knew the 2 loose stone sections well enough to know exactly where to step and where not to, and it was practical to clear the route for the 2 behind me. I called back the footing points without ceremony, the way you do with colleagues in the field when the information is useful and the person behind you has the competence to use it. Left edge, 2nd stone, step over the gap, right side, flat rock, not the angled one. Celadon had the spare equipment case. I noticed she had picked it up from the storage under the stairs when we assembled at the terrace. Without being asked and without making a point of it, she had the shoulder straps adjusted correctly for her height and was carrying it with the forward lean that distributes the weight properly on a descent. I had not shown her how to do this. She had either done it before or she had looked at how Rivakith was carrying the baseline gauge and worked out the principle herself. Either way, she was carrying it correctly. Rivakith had the baseline gauge horizontal, not angled, the correct carry method for sensitive gauge equipment on uneven terrain. It preserves the calibration and prevents the settlement fluid in the measurement column from shifting before you reach the site. I had not instructed her to carry it that way. She simply carried it that way because she knew, and knowing was sufficient. We reached the upper marker at 6:38, 2 minutes inside the window, which was the right margin for a measurement that required the sediment line to be stable before you started reading. I showed Rivakith the gauge mount position, gave her the baseline reading target and the acceptable variance range, and explained the signal protocol for when I needed a comparative reading from the upper position. She listened to the full explanation without interrupting, asked one question about the reference calibration mark and how it interacted with the morning temperature differential in this specific valley, understood the answer in a single exchange, and then she was set up at the mount, with the gauge level and the reading indicator positioned exactly at the calibration mark. It was the efficiency of someone who needed only the site-specific information, rather than the procedural instruction, the procedure she already had. I went down to the bend. Sediment work at a river bend during the low water window is the kind of task I find satisfying in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not done survey work. It requires complete and specific attention, and for the time it requires that attention, everything else becomes functionally irrelevant. The grain transport rerouting problem, the Article 11 documentation, the careful geometry of 3 people learning to share a house and 2 of them working out whether they could be in the same room without managing the space between them so deliberately. All of it irrelevant for 20 minutes while I was reading the gradient at the bend and cataloging what the sediment was telling me. The gradient reading was exactly what Reviketh's Velserath comparison data had predicted it would be, which meant the model was accurate and the adjustment I had made to my seasonal projection was correct. I logged the primary reading, triple-checked the sediment sample depth, and signaled the upper marker. Reviketh's response came back clean and immediate. She had the baseline. The reading matched the calibration target within the acceptable variance. We ran 3 comparison readings at different points along the arc of the bend, with Celadon moving the sample containers between positions without needing instruction. She watched the pattern once and understood the spatial logic of it, which was the same systematic spatial logic she applied to everything else I had observed her doing. At the 3rd measurement point, there was a section of exposed substrate I had not previously sampled. Reviketh had descended to the lower position to cross-check the sediment line, and she called up to me before I capped the sample to note the mineral banding at that section. The composition was inconsistent with the model's base assumption in a way that was going to require a dedicated follow-up survey. She was right. I flagged the section and noted it in the log. When the full measurement set was complete, I returned to the upper position. Reviketh showed me the baseline log she had kept. It was clean, consistent, documented in the same notation shorthand she used for her own field data, which meant it was immediately readable to anyone who had worked with her comparison sets, which, at this point, included me. Good log, I said. Standard format, she said. Same system I use in the Velserath surveys. The compact should standardize it across agencies, I said. Projects lose 10 days every time 2 teams have to translate between notation formats. She made a sound that landed somewhere between neutral and faintly amused. I was learning to distinguish the registers. Celadon had found a flat-topped boulder above the waterline during the measurement period and was sitting on it reviewing the expanded correction protocol, which she had apparently transferred to a compact reference document she kept in her jacket pocket. She was reading with the specific focused stillness of someone working a problem rather than simply reviewing text. The slight forward lean, the particular quality of attention that means the document is pushing back and being pushed in turn. When I climbed back to the upper position, she closed the document and looked at the valley. The water resource classification issue, she said, to no one in particular but audible to both of us. The mineral gradient in the eastern river, if the 3rd month shift is more significant than the current model accounts for. The colony's water allocation formula will produce an underestimate for the rainy season volume. How much of an underestimate? I said. The formula uses a standard gradient assumption, she said. If the actual gradient is different from the assumption, the output for the rainy season volume will be wrong by whatever proportion the gradient is off from what the model expects. She paused. The correction protocol I am drafting addresses the classification error in the base document, but the underlying calculation will still produce the wrong output if the input gradient is wrong. The gradient is wrong, Reviketh said. She was coiling the gauge cable with the systematic care of someone putting equipment away properly rather than quickly. She did not look up from the task. The 3rd month shift is 15 to 20% more significant than the colony's model predicts, she said. I have seen the same pattern in 3 other systems with comparable mineral substrate. Celadon looked at her. Reviketh looked at Celadon. It was, as far as I could observe, the first time they had spoken directly to each other without me present as an explicit intermediary, not through me, not around me, not using me as a relay point. Directly. The correction protocol will need the actual gradient coefficient to produce an accurate output, Celadon said. Her voice was even, precise, the register she used for factual statements. If you have the Velserath benchmark data in a usable format. I have it, Reviketh said. I can provide it in whatever format you need. Compact standard format. For the protocol submission. Half a day to convert the notation. Celadon nodded once. Then we can integrate it before Moran submits. Neither of them looked at me during this exchange. I was carrying the sample containers back to the equipment case and listening, and I found the exchange. For reasons I did not immediately analyze. Satisfying. It had approximately as many words as the task required. No more. We climbed back up the trail. The sun had cleared the eastern ridge by the time we reached the plateau, and the valley below was bright, the morning haze not yet settled. From up here, the gradient shift was visible in the water's surface if you knew what to look for. The slight change in how the river moved at the 4-kilometer mark. The way the current narrowed and accelerated before opening again on the other side of the bend. I pointed it out to both of them. Neither of them needed the explanation. Rivakith had seen it from below during the measurements, and Celadon had read the description in the survey documentation. But both of them looked at the bend for a moment before we continued up the trail. We walked back to the house. The morning was at that point in its development where the haze was just beginning to move in from the plateau edge, softening the valley light and making the river at the bottom less distinct. In another hour it would be fully closed off. By midday the valley would be invisible from the terrace and would not reappear until late afternoon cleared it again. I had watched this cycle repeat every day for 14 months, and I had not stopped finding it a reliable structuring feature of the working day. Morning light for close work, midday for thinking, afternoon for the view. Rivakith walked slightly ahead of me on the flat section of the trail near the top, the gauge case slung over one shoulder, the morning's data already organized in her head into whatever she was planning to do with it next. I had been watching how she processed information in the field for 6 weeks, and I had a reasonable working model of it now. She categorized quickly and held the categories cleanly and did not revisit them unless she found a reason to. Celadon walked beside me. She had returned the equipment case to her shoulder without being asked and was moving at a pace that suggested 45 minutes of frontier descent had not cost her anything she had not expected to spend. The protocol is going to need to go in earlier than I planned, she said, because of the water resource section. Because of the water resource section and the gradient coefficient, and what the coefficient does to the severity classification of the original error. She looked ahead at the trail. If the gradient shift is 15 to 20% more significant than the model assumes, the underestimate is not a minor correction. It is a resource allocation failure waiting to happen in the rainy season. How long to incorporate the additional data once you have it? 2 days for the water resource section, assuming the benchmark data is in compact standard format when it arrives. 1 additional day to cross-check the coefficient integration and run the revised severity calculation. She paused. The submission deadline I was working toward is no longer appropriate given the revised severity. I did not ask what the new deadline was. She would tell me when she had calculated it. We came off the trailhead onto the terrace. The morning was still, the haze settling in over the plateau edge. Inside, the house was quiet in the particular way it is quiet at that hour, which is the quiet of a space that has been occupied and worked in and has accumulated something from that, different from the quiet of a space that is simply empty. Rivakith set the gauge case on the equipment table in the storage area and began the post-survey maintenance process, which she did with the same systematic care she brought to the pre-survey setup. Not quickly, not slowly, at the pace the task required. I put the kettle on. 3 days, I said, when the water was heating. If the benchmark data is on the shared drive by tomorrow noon, and the protocol draft is complete by the end of the day after, I can submit at the start of the 3rd day. That is within the adjustment window for a revised severity classification. Celadon set her jacket on the chair by the kitchen alcove. She was running the calculation in her head. I could see it in the particular quality of stillness she had when she was working through numbers. That is workable, she said, if the data arrives on time. From the storage area, Rivakith's voice came through clearly. It will arrive on time. Chapter 4. Dinner. That afternoon, after the survey run, the 3 of us worked in our usual arrangements for a while. Celadon returned to the correction protocol at the kitchen table. I took my gradient data to the terrace. Rivakith spent an hour in the storage area running post-collection analysis on the morning sediment samples, and then, at some point in the late afternoon, that I registered only because the sounds from the storage area changed. She stopped doing that and did something else. I came in from the terrace at around 5 to refill my tea and found her in the kitchen alcove. She had produced ingredients from somewhere in the storage space that I had not known she kept there, which told me she had been accumulating supplies quietly over the course of 6 weeks without making any point of it. She was moving with the same economy she brought to fieldwork. No unnecessary steps, no wasted motion. The particular focused efficiency of someone doing a familiar task in an unfamiliar kitchen and making the adjustments as she went. The smell when it started was warm and mineral and specific in the way that food cooked by someone who actually knows what they are doing with frontier supplies is specific, not the smell of the dining hall. Something considerably better than that. Seladin looked up from the protocol. She looked at Reviketh's back. She looked back at the document. She said nothing. I poured my tea and went back to the terrace and also said nothing. There was nothing to say. Reviketh was cooking. She had not asked for commentary. By the time the valley light had moved into the cooler blue-gray of early dusk, she had set 3 portions on the kitchen table, poured water for all 3 of us, moved Seladin's document case to the chair beside her to make room, and sat down. There was no announcement, no ceremony. She simply sat down and started eating, and the 2 of us, already at the table, did the same. The colony's nightlights were beginning to come on across the plateau. Through the terrace window, the valley was making its transition from late afternoon gold into the shadow of dusk. The river at the floor, still visible as a line of moving light, catching the edge of the settlement's exterior lighting. The bend at the 4-kilometer mark where we had spent the morning was a dark curve in the shadow, barely distinguishable from this distance, but I knew where it was. We ate for a while without talking. That was not unusual. The 3 of us had eaten most of our meals without talking, in the dining hall or at the table, and by this point, the quiet had a texture that was different from the compressed silence of the first days. Not comfortable exactly. Not yet, but not strained either. Something in between. I was the one who started it. The water allocation formula, I said, when we were about halfway through the meal. It uses the same base document as the agricultural filing, same classification index. Yes, Seladin said. She set down her fork for a moment and looked at the draft protocol on the chair beside her, as though confirming something. Same classification error, same systematic propagation through every filing that references the base document. The agricultural correction protocol addresses the classification error in the agricultural sector. If I extend it to include the water resource classification, the single protocol addresses both issues under one submission. The processing time increases by approximately 12 additional pages of documentation. Add them, I said. The rainy season is 9 weeks out. Both corrections need to be filed before the 3rd-month window closes. She nodded. She reached over and made a notation in the margin of the protocol without picking it up. Reviketh had been eating with the focused economy she brought to most things. But she was watching the valley through the terrace window rather than looking at the table. After a moment, she said, without turning, the eastern benchmark, the gradient coefficient. I want to revise my estimate. I set down my own fork. What to? 15% was based on the Velserath data. But Velsera's substrate has a higher silicate fraction than Aerith 6's eastern river system. She was still looking at the valley. Aerith's eastern river substrate is higher in manganese, lower in silicate. The manganese content slows the thermal differential that drives the gradient shift. The shift is probably 18 to 22%, not 15. Better to use 20 as the correction coefficient. It falls within the Velserath variance range, and it accounts for the manganese component properly. 20, I said. I updated the figure in my survey tablet and ran the revised seasonal projection. The numbers settled into their new positions. The rainy season model adjusted accordingly, and the gap it had been carrying in the 3rd-month column since the beginning of the dataset closed cleanly, the way a gap closes when you finally have the right number to fill it. Seladin had gone very still beside me. I recognized the quality of the stillness. It was the stillness she had when she was running a calculation, not a simple addition, but the kind of calculation that requires holding several dependent values in sequence and tracing what changes when one of them changes. I had seen it at the terrace door on the 10th day when she was verifying the procedural approach for the agricultural correction. I had seen it on the trail that morning when she was working out the revised deadline. If the gradient correction coefficient is 20%, she said, and her voice had that particular evenness she used when she was stating something she had just confirmed, rather than proposing something she was still working out. The water allocation formula's rainy season output will be understated by approximately 35%. Not 30. I looked at her. That is not a standard correction, I said. No, she said. A 35% underestimate in the rainy season water allocation is a critical resource failure, not a correction filing, a resource allocation failure waiting to happen. She was looking at the draft protocol in the chair beside her. It changes the severity classification of the submission, which changes the required review timeline, which changes the submission deadline. What is the new deadline? 10 days, she said, not 19. At 35% underestimate. The compact registry classifies this as a critical resource correction. The review window is compressed because the failure consequence is immediate, not deferred. She paused. I can have the protocol ready for submission in 3 days if I have the benchmark data by tomorrow, which means the submission goes in with 7 days to spare on the critical deadline, which is the minimum margin I would want. I can submit at the start of day 3, I said. If the protocol is complete, it will be complete. She turned to look at Rivakith. It was the first time, in 6 weeks of shared meals at various tables, that Celadon had looked directly at Rivakith across a table rather than to the side of her, past her, or into the middle distance that happened to include her. Not peripheral management. Direct. Rivakith had turned from the valley window. She met the look with the same directness she brought to most things. The steady, flat-on attention of someone who does not look away from what is in front of her. The benchmark data, Celadon said. Compact standard format. I need it to be clean enough to integrate directly into the protocol without a translation pass. It will be clean, Rivakith said. I will format it correctly. The shared drive, Celadon said. I will send it tonight. Neither of them looked away for a moment. It was not a confrontation, and it was not a reconciliation. It was two professionals confirming an agreement with eye contact, the way people do in the field when the task is specific and the deadline is real, and there is no time for anything except the work. Then Rivakith looked back at her plate and continued eating. Celadon looked back at the protocol and picked up her fork. I finished my meal. Outside, the valley had moved fully into dusk. The river at the bottom was no longer visible. The colony's nightlights made their slow, steady pattern across the plateau edge, and the settlement from this distance looked exactly like what it was. A small practical thing in a large practical place, lit by the ordinary light of people doing ordinary work in the dark. After the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, the documents came back to the table. This was not something any of us planned. Celadon had the expanded protocol draft. I had the revised gradient data and the rainy season projection model. Rivakith had the terrain mapping grid she always worked with in the evenings, which she spread in her usual organized rows across whatever space she had claimed at the table's edge. The 3 sets of work occupied the table in the arrangement that made sense given the space, and the 3 of us occupied the chairs that went with the work, and we sat down and continued. It was the first time we had done this deliberately, not because the dining hall tables were claimed, not because the small tables were occupied, because the work was here, and this was where the work happened. Celadon worked through the water resource section of protocol with the focused precision I had come to associate with her approach to complex documents. Methodical, sequential, a brief pause at each section boundary to verify that what she had just written connected correctly to what came before and what would come after. She made annotations in the margin in her small, exact handwriting. She did not ask questions unless she had a specific question, and when she did ask one, it was specific and she was ready to use the answer immediately. At one point, she stopped and looked at the mineral survey model I had open on my tablet. The water resource cross-reference, she said. The formula references the Eastern Valley survey data for the base precipitation input. If the survey model I am referencing is the one with the uncorrected gradient assumption, the protocol will use a wrong input even after the classification error is fixed. The model on my tablet has the corrected coefficient, I said. I updated it this afternoon with the 20% figure. I will send you the updated version tonight, so you are working from the corrected data. She nodded and went back to the protocol. Rivakith was working through something in her terrain data, making notations in her shorthand with the quiet consistency of someone who processes field observations the same way every time regardless of what else is happening around her. At some point, stopped and she looked at the section of her mapping grid that covered the Eastern Valley area near the 4-kilometer bend. "The section I flagged this morning," she said. "The exposed substrate with the inconsistent mineral banding. I noted it for a follow-up survey," I said. "The banding pattern is consistent with a secondary aquifer discharge point," she said. "If there is a secondary aquifer discharging at that location, it is feeding into the river's volume at the bend, which would affect both the gradient reading and the rainy season volume projection independently of the thermal differential." She looked at the mapping grid for another moment. "I want to survey that section before you submit the mineral model." "How long?" "Half a day for the initial assessment. I will know within the first 2 hours whether it is worth a full survey." "The day after tomorrow," I said. "The protocol goes in on day 3. We can run the aquifer assessment the morning of day 2, and I can incorporate any relevant data into the model before submission." She looked at the terrain grid. She was running the assessment in her head, calculating what she could and could not determine in half a day, what the margin of uncertainty would be, and whether it was acceptable. "That works," she said. The night lights across the valley made their pattern. The terrace window was dark now, the valley completely invisible, and the sound of the plateau's night wind moved through the seal gaps that the house's door insulation had not entirely eliminated. I had been meaning to report the seal gap since the 2nd week and had not gotten to it. I noted it again and did not get to it again. Celadin set down her stylus. She looked at the protocol for a moment, the way she looks at something when she has reached the end of a section and is confirming that it says what she intended. Then she looked at Revaketh. "The benchmark data," she said. "When you send it to the shared drive tonight, flag the 3rd-month gradient entries separately from the annual baseline. I will be working through the water resource section in order, and I need the 3rd-month entries accessible without having to sort through the full data set. Already planned to," Revaketh said. She was coiling the gauge cable she had brought in from the storage area. "I will label the folders so the 3rd-month entries are at the top of the directory." Celadin nodded once. She picked up her stylus and returned to the document. I was watching this, not because I was trying to watch it, but because my desk faced that direction and both of them were in my line of sight. What I was watching was not dramatic. It did not look like anything in particular. 2 people discussing file organization at a kitchen table late in the evening, with survey equipment and protocol drafts spread between them and the settlement's night lights making patterns through the window. But I had been at this table every evening for 6 weeks, and I knew what the evenings had sounded like before tonight. And this was not the same. It was Revaketh who said it first. She had finished the entry she was working on and set down her stylus, and she was looking at the terrain grid with the particular stillness that meant she was done for the night rather than pausing. "The benchmark data," she said to Celadin. "I will send it tonight. Not tomorrow noon. Tonight, when I finish here." Celadin looked up. "I will incorporate it first thing in the morning," she said. "The water resource section should be complete by midday if the data is clean." "The data will be clean. Then the protocol will be ready for Moran to review by late afternoon." She paused. "We should cross-check the gradient coefficient integration before he submits. I want another set of eyes on that section specifically." "Together," Revaketh said. It was one word. She did not qualify it or attach a parallel construction to it or suggest an alternative arrangement in the same sentence. Just together. As a fact about how the work was going to happen. Celadin looked at her for a moment. Something passed across her expression that I did not have a name for, but that I noted in the way I note most things, as information about the state of a situation. "That works," she said. They both looked at me. "Day 3 for the submission," I said. "That gives us the morning to review the full protocol and the afternoon to prepare the filing package before I take it to the coordination office." They both nodded. Outside, the valley held the night the way frontier valleys do, steady, indifferent to the human business being conducted in the lit buildings above it, running at its own particular pace and gradient. The river was down there in the dark, moving at the speed the substrate and the seasonal cycle and the corrected coefficient determined it moved, accurate and unhurried, the same as it had been moving before we measured it that morning, and the same as it would be moving after we were done. I gathered my tablet and the evening's notes and said goodnight. From behind me, as I reached the terrace door, the sound of two people at a table continuing to work. Chapter 5. The aquifer assessment on day 2 took 3 hours rather than 2. Rebekah found what she was looking for at the 2-hour mark, which was the specific exposure pattern in the substrate that indicated a secondary discharge point, and then spent an additional hour documenting it correctly. Because she had decided that if she was going to do it, she was going to do it with enough rigor that the data would be usable in the mineral survey model without a follow-up pass. I was with her for the first part and then climbed back to the upper survey position to collect the reference measurements she needed from above the bend. The secondary aquifer discharge was real. It was feeding into the river's volume at the bend at approximately 6% of the total flow during the 3rd-month window, which was not enormous but was not negligible either, particularly when combined with a gradient coefficient that was already 20% more significant than the model had assumed. The two factors interacted in the rainy season projection in a way that was not additive but compounding. Each one made the other's effect larger. Together they moved the water allocation underestimate from 35% to something closer to 40%. I updated the model on the trail back up to the plateau. I told Celadon the revised figure when we got in. She put the kettle on and did not say anything for approximately 90 seconds, which was the longest I had seen her go without speaking when she was awake and had information to process. 40%, she said, finally, approximately, within a 3% margin either direction, depending on the 3rd-month precipitation variance. She looked at the protocol draft on the table. The severity classification moves again. It does. The submission window moves with it. 7 days, I said. We have 7 days to file. She picked up her stylus. She looked at the draft for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating the load-bearing capacity of a structure they had already built, determining which sections would hold and which ones needed reinforcement. Then she sat down and went to work. Rebekah went to the storage area to process the aquifer samples. I went to the terrace with the updated model. We worked through the afternoon in the arrangement we had arrived at over the past weeks, each in our own section of the house, each on the piece of the problem that was ours to solve. The sounds of the house at that hour had become familiar in the way that sounds become familiar when you have been living inside them long enough. Celadon's stylus on the tablet in the kitchen, the particular rhythm of her moving between sections of a document, the faint systematic noise from the storage area that meant Rebekah was cataloging samples, the plateau wind moving through the seal gap in the terrace door that I was still meaning to report. By the time the afternoon light changed and the haze began to thin, the protocol was 8 pages longer than it had been that morning. The aquifer data was integrated into the mineral survey model, and the filing package was taking shape. The review session on day 3 started at 7 in the morning. I had not suggested a time. When I came to the kitchen at 6:50, Celadon was already at the table with the protocol printed in hard copy, which she did for documents she was doing final review on because she caught different things on paper than on a screen. She had a notation system that used 4 different marks in 4 different margins, depending on what type of issue she was flagging. And the document in front of her already had marks on approximately a third of the pages. Rebekah came in from the storage area at 7:02 with the formatted benchmark data on her tablet and the aquifer's assessment summary in her field notebook. She sat down across from Celadon, turned her tablet to the angle that made it visible to both of them, and they started. I made tea for the 3 of us and sat at the end of the table with the mineral survey model and the filing package documents. My review was a different kind of review from theirs. I was checking that the coordination office submission requirements were met, that the authorization codes were correctly formatted, that the filing package was complete and in the right order. Administrative work, not technical work. The technical work was happening at the other end of the table. They worked through the protocol together, section by section, not simultaneously, not in parallel, but sequentially. One of them reading while the other followed on her own copy. And when they reached a section that needed discussion, they discussed it in the specific, efficient way of 2 people who are past the stage of working out whether the other one is competent. They were not past the stage of working out everything else, but they were past that particular stage. And it showed in the texture of the conversation. No excess caution, no unnecessary qualification, no careful management of how direct they were being. just the work. When they reached the gradient coefficient integration section, Raveketh walked Celadon through the benchmark data structure, and Celadon walked Raveketh through the protocol's calculation logic. And together they verified that the integration was producing the correct output at each calculation step. It took 40 minutes. At the end of it, the section had 2 additional clarifying notations in the margin and 1 revised figure in the main text, and it was correct. "This section is clean," Raveketh said. Celadon made the final notation and moved to the next one. By midday, the protocol was reviewed. By 2 in the afternoon, the filing package was assembled. I submitted it to the coordination office at 3:15, with Celadon listed as originating reviewer and protocol author, Raveketh listed as field data contributor and gradient coefficient specialist, and my name on the submission authorization line. Peth processed the intake form at the coordination office window without comment. He stamped the receipt and handed me the copy. He did not ask what the filing was or how the 3 of us had come to produce it together. He was, I had concluded, a man who had learned that some things work out better than he expected and that the appropriate response was to process the paperwork without making it strange. I walked back to the house with the receipt copy in my jacket pocket. The afternoon was clear. The haze already beginning to lift off the plateau. The valley visibles below the terrace in the particular gold of late afternoon light. The river at the bend was a bright line from this distance, moving at whatever speed the substrate and the seasonal cycle and the corrected coefficient determined it should be moving. That evening the documents came back to the table, but not the protocol. The protocol was filed. What came back to the table was the ordinary work. My river survey model, Celadon's expanded registry restoration application, which she had been working through in the intervals between the protocol sections, and Raveketh's terrain mapping data from the aquifer assessment, the ordinary working evening, which had become, in the past weeks, the texture of how we spent the time after dinner. Raveketh had cooked again. She had not announced this or asked whether it was wanted. At some point between 2 in the afternoon and 6 in the evening, she had gone to the Kahalani supply point and come back with ingredients, and had produced a meal that was better than anything the dining hall had offered in the 14 months I had been eating there. We ate, and then the documents came out, and we worked. The valley outside went through its usual transition from afternoon gold to the blue-gray of dusk to the dark of night, the river becoming a line of reflected light and then invisible, the night lights coming on across the plateau. Celadon set down her stylus. She looked at the protocol for a moment, or rather at the empty space where the protocol had been, since she had filed the hard copy in her document case after submission. Then she looked at me. "You have treated this arrangement," she said, "as though it were an ordinary working situation." I considered how to answer this accurately. "It is an ordinary working situation," I said. "The administrative mechanism that created it is unusual. The situation itself is not." She was quiet for a moment. Raveketh had not stopped writing, but the rhythm of it had changed slightly. The kind of change that means someone is listening carefully while continuing to do something else. "Most males in Article 11 arrangements do not treat them that way," Celadon said. Her voice was the same measured register she used for factual statements. Not accusatory, not warm, simply observational. The voice of someone who has seen enough of a pattern to speak about it with confidence. The provision was designed for resettlement stability. In practice, males who qualify for Article 11 cohabitation compacts tend to treat the arrangement as a status acquisition. They treat the co-residents as an institutional outcome rather than as people who have professional standing and work to do. "That seems like a significant amount of unnecessary management," I said. Across the table, Raveketh made a sound, definitively amused. I had been calibrating that register for 6 weeks, and I was certain. Celadon looked at her briefly. Something in Celadon's expression shifted in a direction I had not seen before. A fractional movement at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile and was not trying to be. "The document submission," Celadon said, returning her attention to me. "When you listed me as originating reviewer, you originated the review," I said. "That is what the field requires. What happened is what it says. Not as co-resident, not as Article 11 assignee." She looked at me steadily. "Originating reviewer. That is what you were. The field has a specific meaning. I used it correctly." She was quiet for a moment, a different quality of quiet from her usual processing pause. the quiet of someone arriving at a conclusion they had been building toward for longer than this conversation. My registry standing was suspended 18 months before Aerith 6, she said. In those 18 months, I have been addressed in official communications as the Dawn appointee, the former magistrate, the Article 11 eligible female, and, once, in a compact housing office document, the tall one. She picked up her stylus and made a brief notation in the margin of the restoration application. Something small and specific that she had apparently just remembered. You called me by my name on the first morning. You have called me by my name every morning since. It is your name, I said. Rivakith set down her stylus. She looked at the tablet in front of her, where the Eastern Valley terrain grid was displayed. Her Velserath benchmark data in the archive structure. Her notation. Her attribution. All of it exactly where it should be and labeled exactly as it should be labeled. I have been a territorial assessment specialist for 11 years, she said. In 11 years, I have had my survey data accurately attributed to me by name twice, not credited to my supervising officer as a general survey contribution, not listed under the Survey Corps aggregate output, to me, by name, as the person who collected and analyzed it. She looked at the tablet for another moment. You cited the third-month correction in your survey log the same day I gave it to you, by name, my name and classification. It is your data, I said. If someone uses your data in a model, the model's record should reflect whose data it is. If it does not, the provenance of the model is inaccurate. That is a problem with the model, not a minor administrative detail. Rivakith looked at Celadon. Celadon looked at Revakith. What happened in the following silence I cannot describe with complete accuracy because I am not certain I understood it fully at the time. What I can say is this: the 6 weeks of careful spatial management, the staggered kitchen windows, the parallel occupation of the dining hall, the table negotiation that neither of them had ever formally agreed to, but that had produced an accurate division of space anyway. All of that did not dissolve. 6 weeks of careful navigation does not dissolve in a single evening. That is not how these things work, and I did not expect it to. But something in the geometry of the three of us shifted. The way a survey model shifts when you finally add the variable you have been missing. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just more accurately than it was before. It was Rivakith who moved first. The benchmark data, she said to Celadon. I flagged the third-month gradient entries separately in the shared drive. The folders are labeled so the entries sort to the top of the directory automatically. She paused. For the next time you need them. Celadon looked at her. The restoration application references the protocol submission as supporting documentation, she said. I listed both our names as contributing professionals in the covering letter, not just mine. The registry will see the professional collaboration record when they review the standing reinstatement. Rivakith was quiet for a moment. I did not know you had done that. You were the field data contributor and gradient coefficient specialist, Celadon said. That is what the covering letter says. That is what the submission record says. That is accurate. Something passed across Revakith's expression that I noted as information about the state of something I did not have a precise name for yet. She looked at the terrain grid on her tablet, then out at the valley through the terrace window, then back at the table. The aquifer section, she said, the secondary discharge point data. I want to run a full survey of that area before the rainy season, not half a day. A full 3-day assessment. The discharge pattern suggests there may be a connected system further up the valley slope that would affect the long-term water resource projections significantly. Put together the survey plan, I said. I can get coordination office authorization once I have the scope. She nodded. Celadon had returned to the restoration application. She was writing in the unhurried way she wrote when she was at the end of something rather than the middle of it, the pen moving steadily across the page. No pauses for recalculation or verification. The valley held the night outside the terrace window. The river was invisible at the bottom of it, but I knew exactly where the bend was and approximately what the water was doing at that bend at this hour. And the knowing was different now from how it had been 3 weeks ago because the data that supported it was better, more accurate, built from the work of 3 people who had each brought the thing they were specifically qualified to bring, and who had not wasted any of it. We worked until the colony's late-night lights came on across the plateau. Then we went to bed. 3 months later. This is what the coordination log says. The Water Resource Correction Protocol was submitted 7 days after the evening at the kitchen table, filed under the expanded scope Celadon had planned, and then extended twice as the data grew more complete. Both corrections accurately attributed. Celadon D, originating reviewer and protocol author. Raveketh K, field data contributor and gradient coefficient specialist. Moran C, coordination office submitter. The compact registry processed it in 4 days. The colony's water allocation formula is now accurate. The rainy season, which has been running for 3 weeks, is exactly within the revised projection that used Raveketh's 20% coefficient and the 6% aquifer discharge figure from the bend. The column that would have been 40% understated is instead precise. The settlement's water management has not had to make a single emergency adjustment since the revised formula took effect. The mineral survey model, with Raveketh's Velserith Eastern benchmark and aquifer assessment incorporated, and my gradient data recalibrated, and Celadon's a water resource cross-reference added as a supporting layer, is the most complete dataset the Eastern Valley has produced in Aerith 6's 7-year history. All 3 names are on it. All 3 names are correctly attributed to the sections they contributed. The archive record will say so for however long the archive exists. The Article 11 compact documentation came through 2 weeks after we submitted the protocol. Peth delivered it personally, knocked on the terrace door with the particular care of a man who has learned to knock carefully at this specific door, and handed the folder to me with the expression of someone who is relieved that a situation he was initially uncertain about appears to have resolved itself without requiring his intervention. I put the folder on the kitchen table. Celadon read it through in the systematic way she reads everything. Made one notation in the margin where she found a minor formatting inconsistency that was not substantively important, and filed it in the document case, where she keeps things that have been correctly resolved. Raveketh came to the kitchen doorway, looked at the folder on the table, said something in Velserath that I could not translate, but that had the register of something between satisfied and final, and went to the storage area to retrieve the ingredients she had decided to use for dinner. The eastern room is Celadon's. Her document cases are stacked in the corner beside the desk in the order she uses them, and the desk surface has the organized precision of someone who knows exactly where everything is and maintains it that way without effort because that is simply how she works. The morning light comes in from 6 until 9, and she is always at the desk before it arrives. I have started timing my morning tea by the sound of her settling in at the desk, which is not intentional but is accurate. The western room is Raveketh's, and her terrain maps cover approximately 40% of the kitchen table at any given time, which is a spatial arrangement that was arrived at through iteration rather than agreement, which is generally how things settle when people share a space long enough. I have stopped considering this an intrusion and started considering it a feature of the kitchen. The way the storage area under the stairs is a feature of the house. It is there. It is useful, and it is part of what the space is. The small room off the terrace is mine. My survey equipment lives under the stairs. I am still up before the settlement most mornings and out on the eastern trail before 6, and the room that opens directly onto the trailhead is, as I determined in the first week, the right room for the person who uses the trail that way. The dining hall long table is where we sit most evenings, all 3 of us, with work spread between the trays and the colony's dark-grade tea in the standard issue cups, and the valley going through its usual transitions outside the windows. I did not plan this. None of us planned this. It is simply what the evenings became, and at some point, what the evenings became what the evenings are. I did not request any of this. The Article 11 provision found me through a registry threshold and a housing unit with a sufficient number of rooms. I read the documentation, made tea, put a room allocation sheet on the kitchen table, and was present at the correct time. That is the whole of what I did in the beginning. The rest of it, the 40 minutes cross-referencing gradient data, the spare tea packet on the counter, the submissions with the correct name in the correct field, the trail down to the valley floor at 6:10 in the morning, the 3 of us at the long table in the dining hall with work spread between the trays. None of that was something I planned. It was something I did because it was the accurate thing to do in the situation I was in. I am not certain I know how to describe what the situation is now. I know what the record says. I know what the survey log says and what the protocol submission says, and what the compact registry document says. I know that Celadin's registry standing has been fully restored and that she has taken on 3 additional administrative clients in the settlement in the past month. I know that Revaketh's 3-day aquifer survey found a connected discharge system that extends 4 kilometers up the valley slope and is going to require a significant revision of the long-term water resource model, and that she has submitted a proposal to the compact registry for an expanded survey authorization that I co-signed as Coordination Office representative. I know that the mineral survey model, with all 3 names on it, was Compact's quarterly regional resource report last month as most accurate baseline assessment of the Eastern Valley system on record. What I know about the rest of it, I know the way I know most things. By observation, by function, by what happens when you pay attention to what is actually in front of you, and do not require it to be anything other than what it is. Outside, through the terrace window, the valley holds the night the way it always has, running at its own gradient, accurate and unhurried, at exactly the speed the mineral substrate and the seasonal shift and the corrected coefficient determine. The river moves through the dark below us, and it has always been moving at that speed. We just now know what it is.